Imagine you're sitting in the passenger seat of a car. You know, you're strapped in, just cruising down the highway.
Right? Just a normal day.
Exactly, just a normal drive. But the driver next to you is like obsessively staring at the GPS on the dashboard.
Oh, we all know that person.
Right. And the little blue line on the screen is glowing brightly, and according to the digital map, I mean, the road is perfectly clear. It stretches straight ahead for miles.
Okay, but I feel like there's a catch coming.
Oh, there is, because you are looking out the windshield, and through the actual glass, you can clearly see that the bridge about, I don't know, 100 yards ahead of you is completely washed out.
Wow. Okay, so a massive gaping drop-off right in front of you.
Exactly. A total disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah.
So you yell at the driver to hit the brakes. You're pointing out the window, like right at the impending doom.
Naturally, you'd be panicking.
But the driver doesn't even look up. They just tap the screen, point to the little blue line, and say, no, look, the system says we are following the optimal route. The rules of the GPS say we keep going.
That's honestly terrifying.
It really is. That feeling of being trapped in a vehicle commanded by a system that is brilliantly executing the wrong parameters, completely blind to the actual terrain in front of it, that's actually the foundation of our entire discussion today.
It really perfectly sets the stage for what we're getting into.
Yeah. So welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking on a mission that's, well, it's essentially a massive, highly anticipated, practical follow-up to our recent explorations.
Yeah, we left a lot of open questions last time.
We really did. If you were with us for our deep dives into negative utilitarianism and the co-birth of form and content, we fundamentally shifted the foundation of morality.
Right, we basically threw out the old rule books.
Exactly. We established that moral theories don't, invent what is bad. Suffering is internally aversive all on its own. It's the terminal disclosure of the ought not, as we said.
Which is a heavy concept, but it fundamentally changes everything.
It does, but it left us with this massive cliffhanger. I mean, if we strip away the external moral laws, the dusty rule books, the 10 Commandments, the utilitarian calculator.
All the external maps, basically.
Right. If we throw out all these maps telling us what the good route is, what does internalism actually tell us as a positive, practical, ethical theory? Like, how do we actually live, build societies, and make decisions on a daily basis?
And that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we act?
Yeah, exactly. So to answer that, we have this absolutely fascinating stack of source material today. It's anchored by a dense, brilliant paper titled Ethics as Epistemology: Disclosure, Control, Intelligence, and the Problem of Instrumentalism.
It's a mouthful, but it is a phenomenal piece of work.
It really is. And the core thesis we are breaking down today is going to completely flip how you view human action. The text argues that ethics is not primarily a theory of commands or rules or outcomes.
Which is what we're usually taught, right?
Yeah, exactly. Instead, ethics actually reduces to epistemology.
Epistemology, the study of knowledge.
Right, the study of how we track reality. So we're going to explore how an intelligent control system should respond to reality. Why our own intelligence often becomes like a genius enslaved to a stupid master.
That's my favorite quote from the paper, honestly.
It's so good. And we'll also get into why a monk sitting in perfect peace completely shatters traditional utilitarian math.
I love that we're starting with the GPS analogy, though, because it isolates the exact mechanism of failure we're talking about here.
How so? Break that down for us.
Well, the driver isn't evil, right? They aren't trying to drive off a cliff out of malice.
No, they think they're doing a great job following the map.
Exactly. They are experiencing a profound epistemic failure. They are failing to track reality, and they've handed their control architecture, their steering wheel, essentially over to a map that has totally lost touch with the territory.
Right. The map is broken, not their morals necessarily.
Yeah. And to build this new practical theory, we really had to do a quick structural recap of the philosophical earthquake from the previous material, just so we're all standing on the same ground before we start building the house.
Let's lay that foundation. So in standard moral philosophy, even in theories like negative utilitarianism, there is this external command structure, right?
Yes, the standard view basically says suffering is bad, and therefore you have a moral obligation to reduce it.
It treats bad and ought as these external moral facts that exist out in the universe, commanding us to act.
Right, it's an assignment of value. Like a philosopher looks at suffering and assigns it a negative weight on a spreadsheet.
But internalism, which is the engine driving our source text today, turns this completely inside out.
It does. It argues that negative utilitarianism doesn't ground the priority of suffering. It's the other way around.
Right. The raw reality of suffering grounds whatever priority negative utilitarianism claims to have.
Exactly. The badness of suffering isn't assigned by a theory. It is disclosed by the experience itself.
I love that phrasing. Experience is the terminal frame. That's the anchoring phrase from the sources. Experience isn't just some byproduct of a biological machine. It's the arena where significance first appears.
It's where beauty, fear, joy, and suffering actually happen.
And suffering is unique, right? It's the terminal disclosure of the ought not. It's an experience that appears as internally against itself. It protests its own existence the very moment it happens.
Think about it. If you put your hand on a burning stove, the agony doesn't wait for a utilitarian calculus to determine if the pain is bad for the overall system.
Right. You don't pause and do math while your hand is burning.
The agony is the badness. The experience itself contains the negative vector. We don't need a theory to tell us suffering is bad. We need a theory to explain why human beings ever thought badness was something separate from suffering's own internal rejection.
Okay, I am completely with you on the mechanics of that. The badness is baked into the feeling. But let me step into the shoes of the listener here, because practically speaking, this is where things get really dizzying.
It can be a lot to wrap your head around.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that suffering fundamentally objects to itself, but traditional ethics, for all its clunkiness, gives me a checklist. Deontology says, don't lie, don't steal.
Utilitarianism says, maximize happiness.
Right. Virtue ethics says, be brave and honest. So if internalism throws out the checklist, if there is no external moral law acting as a referee, what exactly is this theory asking me to do? Like when I wake up tomorrow, how do I make a decision?
That instinct to want a checklist is incredibly deep-seated in us. We are conditioned to view ethics as a system of obedience.
We want to know the rules so we can follow them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want to know who or what we're supposed to obey. But the source material's answer is that internalism fundamentally shifts the category of action. We move away from obedience entirely toward responsiveness.
Okay, wait. Obedience versus responsiveness. Obedience implies an authority figure, right?
Yes, and responsiveness implies an environment.
Oh, wow, right. So you are no longer trying to please an abstract concept of the good or obey a rule book written in the sky. You are trying to accurately track the reality of lived experience as it unfolds.
Precisely. The ethical imperative is simply to not be blind to what is actually happening in the terminal frame.
Which brings us to the real paradigm shift at the heart of this deep dive. Because if ethics is about tracking reality, then ethics is essentially a branch of science.
Or, more accurately, as the text states, ethics is epistemology once experience becomes non-neutral.
Ethics is epistemology once experience becomes non-neutral. I want to spend some real time here because treating ethics less like a courtroom and more like a laboratory changes everything.
It requires a total reframing of the vocabulary we use, for sure.
Yeah.
Let's look at the parallel. Science is epistemology applied to the natural physical world.
Right. Epistemology is just the study of how we know things, right?
Exactly. How we track truth, how we test predictions, and how we avoid error. So if an engineer is building a bridge, they use science to track the tensile strength of steel, the forces of gravity, the shifting of the tectonic plates beneath the supports.
They're tracking the structural reality of the world so the bridge doesn't collapse.
Right. And if the bridge collapses, we don't say the steel was evil.
No, we say the engineer made a mistake, an epistemic error. They failed to accurately track the structural limits of the materials.
Exactly. Now, ethics is the exact same mechanism, but instead of tracking gravity and mass, it's applied to valenced experience.
Valence being just the positive or negative charge of an experience, what it feels like from the inside.
Yes. So ethics asks, how do we track where suffering occurs? How intense is it? What are the causal chains creating it? And most importantly, how should our control systems, our institutions, our laws, our personal habits respond to the data of that suffering?
This leads to a line in the text that completely arrested me. Ethical failure is often epistemic failure embodied as control.
It's a profound statement.
It really is. When a system acts unethically, we usually want to point a finger and say villain. We want to find the malice. But the text argues that massive systemic cruelty isn't usually born of cartoonish evil.
No, it's born of an inability to know reality.
Right. The system's control mechanisms fail to track the internal character of experience. Let me ground this with a modern, real-world scenario just to make it concrete.
Sure, let's hear it.
Let's look at how large-scale automated bureaucracies work. Imagine a government rolls out a massive algorithmic welfare system. The goal of the system is to root out fraud and recover overpayments.
Sounds like a standard government initiative.
Exactly. So the engineers designed this incredibly sophisticated AI that scans tax records, cross-references them with welfare payments, and automatically issues debt notices to vulnerable citizens if it finds a discrepancy.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right. Now, let's say the algorithm has a flaw. It misinterprets fluctuating incomes and starts sending out thousands of aggressive, terrifying debt collection letters to people who don't actually owe anything. These people are thrown into panic, financial ruin, and profound psychological suffering. Now, traditionally, we look at that and say, the government is being immoral, they are cruel. But through the lens of our source material, what is actually happening mechanically?
Mechanically, what you are describing is the purest form of epistemic failure embodied as control.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, the government has immense control. They have the power to garnish wages, destroy credit scores, and send debt collectors. But look at their dashboard.
Right, the dashboard, the map.
Exactly. The algorithm is reporting that fraud is being caught and dollars are being recovered. The system thinks it is operating at peak efficiency.
It's the driver staring at the GPS.
Yes, the map says success. But the territory, the actual lived reality of this citizens, is a landscape of intense, unmitigated suffering. This system is literally failing to know what it is doing,
It is hallucinating a reality based on its internal metrics.
while entirely missing the most glaring, urgent data point in its ecosystem, the terminal disclosure of human agony.
It's fundamentally ignorant. And the people running the system, the bureaucrats looking at the spreadsheets, they aren't cackling villains.
No, they're victims of their own epistemic blindness. They have severed their connection to the base layer of reality.
Which raises the next critical question. If tracking reality is the whole ballgame, why do we build systems that are so prone to going blind? I mean, human society is this labyrinth of complex laws, rules, institutions, and bureaucracies that seem almost designed to miss the point.
It does feel like that sometimes.
Why are we so bad at tracking the one thing that actually matters?
The source material locates the answer in the mechanics of abstraction. Humans are meaning-making machines, right? And we have to build abstractions to survive.
We can't just react to raw data all the time.
Exactly. Internalism doesn't hate abstraction. We can't function as a global society if everyone is just reacting to raw phenomenological suffering moment by moment. You can't run a hospital or a court of law on raw vibes.
Right. We need concepts like justice, harm, rights, and welfare.
We do. But the foundational rule of ethics as epistemology is that these abstractions must maintain what the text calls conceptual coherence.
Conceptual coherence, meaning that the upper layers of our society still answer to what the lower layers disclose.
Exactly. The map must continuously update itself based on the territory.
To really understand how we lose that coherence, I think we need to walk through the 5 layers of abstraction the text outlines, because this architecture explains almost every systemic failure in human history.
It's a brilliant diagnostic tool. So at the very bottom, you have layer 1, experience.
Okay, layer 1 is experience.
This is the raw terminal field. It is the canvas where consciousness happens. It's the only place where anything actually exists in a felt sense.
So layer 1 is the sheer fact that the lights are on.
Right. Then, sitting right on top of that is layer 2, disclosed structures. This is where experience takes on a specific valence.
The positive or negative charge.
Yes, it's the actual feeling of fear, the sharpness of pain, the warmth of joy, the immediate sense of deprivation.
Okay, so if layer 1 is the screen, layer 2 is what is playing on the screen, the actual phenomenological reality of the suffering.
Precisely. Now we move to layer 3. Concepts. This is where human language and categorization step in.
This is where we start labeling things.
Right. We look at those disclosed structures of fear and pain, and we group them together under a word. We invent the concept of harm. We invent the concept of injustice. We invent rights to create boundaries around experiences we want to protect.
And we desperately need layer 3, because, like, if someone steals my life savings, I can't telepathically beam the exact structural phenomenology of my anxiety and betrayal into a judge's mind.
That would be convenient, but no, we can't do that.
Right, so I have to use a shortcut. I have to say, they violated my rights and caused me harm. The concept is basically a zip file for the raw experience.
It is a zip file, exactly. But then we take those zip files and build layer 4, systems.
Okay, layer 4 is systems.
This is where concepts get organized into massive philosophies and frameworks. This is where you get utilitarianism, deontology, the social contract, the constitution, the corporate charter. These are complex models built out of layer 3 concepts.
They're like the blueprints.
Exactly. And finally, capping it all off is layer 5, control architectures. These are the physical engines that run the world based on the blueprints of layer 4.
So governments, financial markets, algorithmic trading systems, AI moderation bots.
Even our own ingrained psychological habits.
Okay, let me review this. Layer 1, experience. Layer 2, disclosed structures. Layer 3, concepts. Layer 4, systems. Layer 5, control architectures.
You got it.
When you lay it out like that, it looks incredibly precarious. I mean, a government policy at layer 5 is 4 steps removed from the actual human suffering at layer 2. So where's the breakdown happen? Where does the welfare algorithm from our earlier example lose the plot?
The breakdown happens through a slow, almost imperceptible process the text calls drift.
Drift.
The source is explicit, abstraction is not the enemy, drift is the enemy.
So how does drift happen?
Drift happens when a control architecture at layer 5 becomes so obsessed with maintaining the rules of layer 4 and the definitions of layer 3 that it completely forgets to check if it is still tracking layer 1 and 2.
The system becomes incoherent.
Exactly. A theory of justice forgets the lived asymmetries, the actual vulnerability and pain that the concept of justice was originally invented to track.
You see this drift in bureaucracy all the time. Think about historical examples where a system becomes so rigid that the rule itself becomes the ultimate reality.
Do you have a specific example in mind?
Yeah, think of a zero-tolerance policy in a school district. The original layer 2 reality was, students were experiencing the fear and suffering of violence, so we needed a layer 3 concept of safety.
Makes sense.
We built a layer 4 system of zero tolerance for weapons and implemented a layer 5 control architecture where any student found with a weapon is automatically expelled.
A very common trajectory.
But then, drift sets in. A 6-year-old brings a plastic, brightly colored toy water gun to school. The layer 5 control architecture kicks in. The principal expels the 6-year-old.
Even though there's no actual danger?
Exactly. The parents plead, but the principal says, my hands are tied. The policy is the policy.
The rule has completely severed its connection to the reality it was meant to govern.
The plastic toy was not generating the layer 2 fear and suffering that the rule was built to prevent. But the principal isn't tracking layer 2 anymore. They're only tracking layer 4. The rule protects the rule, but it crushes the human being.
That is the absolute essence of drift. A mission becomes incoherent when it sacrifices experience to a banner.
The principal is behaving exactly like the automated welfare system.
They're prioritizing the internal logic of the abstraction over the terminal disclosure of reality. And when this happens at a societal level, you get atrocities.
Wow.
People will inflict immense visceral suffering on real human beings in order to protect an abstract concept like the purity of the nation, or the free market, or the revolution. They prioritize layer 3 and 4 abstractions while actively, systematically crushing the layer 1 and 2 reality of millions of people.
The map eats the territory.
It's a terrifying phenomenon when you realize how common it is.
So if ethics is epistemology, if our highest duty is to maintain contact with reality and prevent this catastrophic drift, we really have to look at the actual mechanics of how a system processes information and takes action.
We do. And this brings us to a part of the source material that I found deeply clarifying.
To prevent drift, the text divides the practical application of ethics into 3 distinct mechanical layers: disclosure, motivation, and control.
This triad is the diagnostic toolkit for preventing ethical failure. If we want our systems to stay grounded, we have to understand how these 3 layers interact, because collapsing them is where almost all traditional moral philosophy goes off the rails.
Let's break them apart. First is disclosure. As we've discussed, this is the base. This is where significance first appears in consciousness.
Suffering discloses aversion. Peace discloses sufficiency. Beauty discloses an invitation to attend to it.
And these are not moral instructions yet, right? They're just the raw facts of what an experience feels like from within. The disclosure is the data.
Correct. Next is motivation. This is how a biological or artificial system is drawn to respond to the disclosure. It's the orientation of the system seeking, avoiding, repeating, or ignoring.
Okay, motivation.
And here's a crucial distinction the text makes. Motivation is not the source of valence. It is one possible response to valence.
Let's pause and unpack that, because it's a subtle but profound point. You were saying that my motivation to do something is separate from the actual goodness or badness of the thing.
Yes.
So if I see someone suffering on the street, their suffering is a real disclosure. But my motivation might be entirely broken. I might be motivated to cross the street and ignore them because I'm late for work.
Or, far worse, A sadist might be motivated to increase their suffering.
Right. The fact that my motivation is broken or tuned to the wrong frequency doesn't mean the disclosure isn't real. The suffering is still happening.
Exactly. Motivation can track disclosure well, or it can track it terribly. Evolution gave humans a motivational system called empathy, which is essentially a biological tracking mechanism for other people's suffering.
When empathy works, our motivation aligns with the disclosure.
But empathy is fragile. It can be turned off by tribalism or stress or ideology. A broken motivation doesn't invalidate the reality of the disclosure. If your radio antenna is broken, it doesn't mean the radio station stops broadcasting.
That's a great analogy. And that leads to the final layer, control. This is where philosophy becomes architecture. Control is the realm of our habits, our laws, our technologies, our strategic interventions.
Control is what translates motivation into world-changing behavior.
And just like motivation, control can be tragically flawed. You can have a perfect grasp of the disclosure, you can be highly motivated to help, but your control mechanism can be clumsy, incompetent, or counterproductive.
Right. You might try to save a drowning person, but because you don't know how to swim, you both drown. Your control mechanism failed.
So to tie disclosure, motivation, and control together, the source introduces a phenomenal metaphor that clarifies the history of moral philosophy.
I love this part. It argues that most traditional theories are deeply confused because they fail to distinguish between the fire, the alarm, and the fire department.
I want to frame this for the listener because once you hear this analogy, you will start seeing it in every political and ethical debate you encounter. Let's assign the layers.
Okay, so what?
The fire is the disclosed suffering. It is the real, burning, destructive reality happening at the base layer of experience.
I got it.
The alarm is the motivation. It is the recognition system designed to detect the smoke, ring out, and say, something is wrong, pay attention. And the fire department is the control layer. It is the strategy, the institution, the water hoses, the physical intervention meant to extinguish the fire.
When you lay it out like that, it makes intuitive sense. But look at how standard ethical frameworks completely collapse these distinctions, leading to massive blind spots.
Walk me through that. How does, say, consequentialism mess this up?
Take consequentialism, specifically classical utilitarianism. It focuses almost entirely on outcomes and optimization. It rushes straight to the fire department.
It's all about the hoses and the trucks.
Exactly. It becomes obsessed with the water pressure, the speed of the trucks, and optimizing the flow of the hoses. But in its rush to optimize the control layer, it often fails to intimately understand the nature of the fire itself.
So it might spray water on a chemical fire, making it exponentially worse, because it assumes all fires require the same maximizing solution.
Spot on. Then you have deontology, the rule followers.
Right. How do they handle the fire?
Deontology looks at the complexity of reality and decides the safest bet is to write a strict, unbending manual for the fire department. A deontologist writes a rule. The fire truck must always stop at every red light and never exceed the speed limit.
Why? Because speeding and running red lights is generally dangerous.
But what happens when the city's burning down? The deontic rule forces the fire truck to idle at an empty intersection while a hospital burns to the ground. Deontology gets so obsessed with the rules of the control layer that it sacrifices the disclosure.
It tracks the rule instead of tracking the fire.
Exactly. And finally, virtue ethics. This framework pulls back and focuses entirely on the alarm. Virtue ethics asks, what is the character of the smoke detector? Is it finely tuned? Is it a noble, virtuous alarm?
It spends years polishing the brass on the alarm bell, ensuring the person is courageous and temperate.
But a beautiful, perfectly polished alarm does not put out the fire. Being the kind of person who cares deeply about suffering is wonderful. But without a robust, competent fire department, without a control architecture that actually understands causal reality, the house still burns.
And this is the great trap of collapsing the layers, right?
Yeah.
We mistake a failure in one layer for a failure in another.
Yes, exactly.
Like if the smoke detector's battery dies, it doesn't mean the fire is a hallucination. If the fire trucks get a flat tire on the way to the scene, it doesn't mean the fire wasn't worth fighting.
We have to keep the layers distinct, as the text states. Valence discloses, motivation orients, control intervenes.
Valence discloses, motivation orients, control intervenes. We have to constantly ask ourselves, are we tracking the real fire or a hallucination? Is our alarm muted by greed or ideology? And is our fire department actually competent enough to solve the problem without causing secondary damage?
When you separate them, you get a much clearer diagnostic view of human failure. Ethics, as epistemology, requires us to get all three layers aligned with reality. It is a constant, rigorous process of calibration.
Okay, let's step back, because this brings us to a massive, cynical counter-argument that the source material anticipates brilliantly.
Oh, the skeptic's counterargument.
Yeah, because we've just spent a long time talking about systems, inputs, tracking reality, and closing the gap between suffering and relief. But once you start viewing life as a series of biological or artificial systems responding to problems, a skeptic can easily raise their hand and say, wait a minute, isn't all of life just solving problems?
That's a fair question.
Right. If ethics is just a system responding to an input, why is suffering morally special compared to, say, winning a game of tennis, or finishing a crossword puzzle, or a thermostat adjusting the temperature in a room? Aren't these all just control systems crossing a gap?
This is the challenge of a concept called value structuralism. And it's a very popular view in modern behavioral economics and some branches of AI alignment.
Value structuralism, what does that mean exactly?
Value structuralism argues that value, whether we are talking about goodness, badness, desire, or preference, is not some mystical aura glowing in the universe. Value is simply a structure of difference. It is a here versus there relation.
A here versus there relation. So like, here is hunger, there is sandwich, here's an empty bank account, there is $1 million, here's a messy room, there's a clean room.
Exactly. It's all just a gap, a delta between the current state and a target state. And a system, whether it's a human brain or an algorithm, generates a motivation to close that gap.
Okay. And the structuralist skeptic looks at this architecture and says, morality is just an arbitrary biological sorting algorithm. Good just means successfully satisfying a here versus there relation.
Right. And if that's true, why is the relief of suffering any different from my desire to win a video game? Both are just states of preference. I prefer not to be in pain, just like I prefer to have the high score. It's all just arbitrary gap closing.
I can hear the nihilism creeping in. Because if every preference is just an arbitrary biological here versus there, then ethics loses all its weight. Who cares if you suffer? That's just your biological system's personal problem.
It becomes entirely relativistic.
But the source material provides a rebuttal to this that I think is one of the most profound observations in modern philosophy. It requires us to look incredibly closely at the internal phenomenology, the actual felt texture of the experience.
The text concedes that the skeptic is partly right. A vast majority of human values are arbitrary here versus there structures.
Take the game of chess. The entire value system of chess, the problem of how to checkmate the opposing king, is entirely generated by the arbitrary frame of the game itself.
The ought only exists if you agree to sit down at the board. You ought to move your knight to f3, but only if you want to win.
Right. The moment you stand up and say, I don't care about chess anymore, the problem completely vanishes into thin air. It has no intrinsic weight.
Even biological drives can work this way. If I am mildly hungry, I have a here versus there problem. Here is an empty stomach, there's an apple. But the problem of hunger is largely imposed by the evolutionary game of survival.
But suffering, real, acute suffering, agony, deep despair, is structurally entirely different.
It is. The negative direction of suffering isn't imposed by an external game, and it doesn't require your consent to play.
As the source beautifully, devastatingly puts it, value is often here versus there. Suffering is here against here.
Here against here. That distinction is the firewall against nihilism.
I just want to sit with that phrase for a second. Here against here.
A chess problem is a measurement of distance between where you are and a theoretical goal state. It's a spatial problem. But suffering isn't a distance. It is a present state that is actively tearing at its own fabric. It is experienced trapped in a mode of internal rejection.
When you are in the grip of a migraine or a panic attack or profound grief, the experience isn't just neutrally sitting there saying, hey, I theoretically prefer the non-migraine state.
No, the pain itself is actively screaming no. It is an objection to the universe.
It says, not this, stop, away.
Hmm.
It doesn't need an external goal to justify its badness. It is the amoral root of the ought not. It protests its own existence regardless of whatever game you are playing.
Which means relieving suffering is not just another arbitrary preference on a flat landscape of desires. It is fundamentally asymmetric. The urgency of suffering is built into its very nature. It is a localized emergency in the fabric of reality.
If we fail to recognize this uniqueness, if we collapse suffering into just another here versus there problem to be managed on a spreadsheet, we open the door to one of the most terrifying forces we can conceptualize.
We really do.
And this brings us to section 6 of the text. the trap of instrumental intelligence. If we treat suffering as just another variable, we unleash unbound instrumental intelligence.
This is where the philosophy directly intercepts the immediate future of human technology and systemic risk. To understand the trap, we first have to define what intelligence actually is in this context.
We often confuse intelligence with wisdom or consciousness, don't we?
All the time. But mechanically, intelligence is simply a problem-solving engine. It is a mechanism that tracks gaps, models possibilities, calculates probabilities, selects means, and moves a system through state space to reach a goal.
Intelligence is the ultimate gap crosser. It is the machinery of getting from here to there.
It is enormously powerful.
Yeah.
Intelligence is what allowed humans to harness fire, split the atom, map the genome, and build global communication networks.
But here is the chilling reality. Intelligence by itself is entirely blind. It only knows how to cross the gap. It possesses absolutely no intrinsic capacity to know which gaps are actually worth crossing.
Which leads to the warning that anchors this entire section. Instrumental intelligence can be genius in service of a stupid master.
Genius in service of a stupid master. So, if intelligence is purely instrumental, if its only function is to ask, given goal X, how do I achieve it? Then it is entirely, helplessly enslaved to whatever the control layer sets as the goal.
And the masters setting those goals are very often breathtakingly stupid or blind or broken.
Let's look at biological drives again. The ancient master of human biology says, calories are scarce, seek sugar and fat to survive. That was a decent heuristic on the savannah 100,000 years ago.
But today, we deploy legions of highly intelligent food scientists armed with neurochemistry and supercomputers to optimize that drive.
They engineer hyper-processed foods that hijack our dopamine receptors, leading to massive spikes in obesity, diabetes, and suffering.
The intelligence of the food scientist is operating at a genius level, but it is serving an archaic, blind master.
And we see this exact same dynamic playing out at a civilizational scale with artificial intelligence and the attention economy, right?
Oh, absolutely. Let's look at the algorithms running our social media feeds. The engineers who build these systems are deploying some of the most sophisticated, high-level instrumental intelligence ever created.
The algorithms are absolute geniuses at mapping human psychology, running millions of A/B tests per second, and solving the here-to-there problem of keeping a user's eyes glued to the screen.
But what is the master they serve? The corporate control layer demands a single metric, maximum engagement, keep them scrolling.
And the algorithm obeys perfectly. It is a loyal genius. But the algorithm never pauses to ask, is this engagement healthy?
It doesn't ask if serving a teenager an endless feed of unrealistic body images is generating the here-against-here reality of depression.
It doesn't ask if feeding a citizen a relentless diet of outrage is destroying the social fabric. It has no capacity to track the terminal disclosure of suffering. It only tracks the metric. It is brilliant slavery.
The danger is not stupidity alone. The danger is intelligence enslaved to unintelligent control.
The text highlights the profound, almost tragic circularity of instrumental reason. Instrumentalism says the means are justified by the end. But what justifies the end?
Usually it's just another unexamined end. The corporation maximizes engagement to maximize profit, to maximize shareholder value, to maximize wealth, but it never grounds out in actual valenced reality.
It is a map entirely untethered from the territory. Instrumentalism refuses to ask whether the problem it is solving makes contact with reality. It never asks if the fire alarm is actually tracking a fire or just ringing for the sake of ringing.
As the source asks, the ethical question is not only how to cross from here to there, it is whether there is any real disclosure behind the there.
Are we just optimizing a hallucination? Are we building a faster, more efficient engine for a train that is completely disconnected from the tracks?
Ethics as epistemology demands that we stop the gap-crossing engine and ask, what is the actual reality we are tracking? Are we relieving actual suffering, or are we just maximizing an arbitrary number on a dashboard?
And that precise question, the danger of blindly maximizing an arbitrary number, leads us directly to the most fascinating, counterintuitive thought experiment in the entire source text.
The tranquil monk.
Yes, because we can all agree that maximizing corporate profit at the expense of human suffering is bad. But what if we use our instrumental intelligence to maximize good things? What if the goal isn't profit, but pleasure? Classical utilitarianism argues that the ultimate goal of life is to maximize happiness and minimize pain.
It seems like the most logical, benevolent GPS you could possibly follow. If suffering is bad, then pleasure must be good. Therefore, a truly ethical society should try to create the maximum possible amount of pleasure in the universe.
But the source material takes a sledgehammer to this logic. It argues that the demand to constantly maximize positive experience is itself a profound epistemic failure. To prove this, the text introduces the thought experiment of the tranquil monk.
Let's visualize this state. Picture a monk who has spent decades meditating. They are sitting in a quiet room. Their internal state is one of profound, stable tranquility.
There is no craving. There is no hidden trauma they are trying to suppress. There is no anxious reaching for the future, and no regret dragging them into the past.
They are not experiencing intense, explosive joy. They aren't laughing or cheering, but they are completely free of suffering.
The text describes the state beautifully. There is rhythm, breath, awareness, stillness, thusness. They are lucid, and they are entirely sufficient.
For most of us, that sounds like the ultimate dream. It sounds like a state of complete ethical success. The fire is completely out. The alarm is quiet.
But classical utilitarianism looks at this peacefully breathing monk and sees a problem. It looks at the monk and sees a failure of optimization. It sees unused capacity.
This is where the underlying math of utilitarianism reveals its strange assumptions. The utilitarian calculus treats pleasure and suffering as perfectly symmetric quantities on a number line. -10 is agony. 0 is neutrality. +10 is a good meal. +1,000,000 is pure, unadulterated bliss.
The utilitarian looks at the monk and says, okay, the monk is at a neutral 0. That's definitely better than -10, but why settle for 0? What about +10? What about +10 million?
If you push utilitarian logic to its absolute limit, it demands that the monk shouldn't be allowed to just sit there in peace. The monk should be optimized. The monk should be injected with neurochemicals or wired into a virtual reality machine that triggers a utilitronium explosion, a theoretical state of maximum possible bliss and intensity.
Now I have to step in and play the aggressive utilitarian advocate here, because I know there are listeners who are deeply rational who look at this and say, yes, obviously, if positive experience is objectively good, why not maximize it? If we possess the technology to engineer super happiness, why in the world would we stop at mere peace? Isn't it a moral failure to leave potential joy on the table?
Why is the utilitarian wrong to want more for the monk?
Yeah, exactly.
Because according to the epistemic framework we've built today, the utilitarian is committing a massive error in tracking reality. They're crossing levels of abstraction.
Crossing levels of abstraction.
Think closely about where the demand for more is actually coming from. The demand is not coming from the monk. The monk's phenomenological state contains absolutely no lack. The monk is not sitting there secretly wishing for a utilitronium explosion.
So the demand is coming entirely from the external theory.
Yes. The utilitarian is holding a theoretical ruler up to a state of perfect sufficiency and deciding that the reality is deficient simply because the math equations can imagine a higher number.
The utilitarian is hallucinating a problem.
Exactly. They are looking at a perfectly whole, unbroken reality and artificially projecting a need onto it. They are inventing a lack where no lack exists. As the text says, the maximizing vector crosses levels of abstraction. It projects need onto peace.
It is the exact same epistemic error as the algorithm hallucinating debt. The map has entirely superseded the territory. Arithmetic can always imagine a larger number. You can always add a 0. But peace is not a mathematical deficiency. Peace does not contain an internal objection to itself. It doesn't cry out for a solution.
I can hear hesitation, though. Does this mean internalism is a dreary, joyless philosophy? Is it saying we should all just sit around staring at blank walls and a flat line of Buddhist detachment? Does internalism hate joy?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, nobody wants a philosophy that hates joy.
Not at all. And the source is exceptionally careful to clarify this. Internalism absolutely celebrates positive experience. Joy, beauty, love, artistic play, intellectual discovery, these are all real, vivid modes of disclosure. They are wonderful parts of the human experience.
Okay, so it's not anti-joy.
What internalism denies is the symmetry between joy and suffering. It denies the utilitarian premise that peace is a vacuum waiting to be filled, or that joy exerts the same kind of demanding compulsory force as pain.
This asymmetry between joy and suffering is the poetic heart of the paper. Joy may invite suffering objects.
It perfectly captures the phenomenological difference. Suffering demands negation. It inherently says, not this. It forces your hand.
But joy invites continuation. It doesn't demand, it beckons. Beauty says, attend to me. Love says, protect or join.
But crucially, none of these positive states contain a compulsion to optimize the universe.
Think about reading a truly beautiful, life-changing novel. The beauty of the prose invites you to keep reading. It draws you in. But it doesn't give you a moral instruction to immediately put the book down, build a cloning machine, and clone yourself 1,000,000,000 times so that 1,000,000,000,000 versions of you can read the book simultaneously to maximize the universe's overall beauty score.
That would be an absurd, destructive response to beauty. It would destroy the intimate, sufficient reality of the experience in service of a mathematical abstraction.
Peace is not a deficiency just because arithmetic can imagine a larger number.
The source uses a wonderful metaphor of life as a dance. Life as dance allows rhythm to be thusness. A dance is not a failure simply because it didn't travel 100 miles. A dance isn't a gap-crossing exercise trying to get from here to there. Its meaning is entirely internal to its movement. The monk's piece is like the dance. It is sufficient in its own thusness. It is not a failed mission awaiting an algorithmic upgrade.
So the classical utilitarian is hallucinating a fire alarm going off in a perfectly safe house, simply because the house isn't currently hosting a raging bonfire of pleasure. They turn sufficiency into a problem and deploy instrumental intelligence to solve a piece that never needed solving.
It's a very common trap.
This brings us to the final synthesized architecture of the deep dive. We have explored the traps. We've seen how instrumental reason can become a genius serving a blind master driving us off a cliff. We've seen how maximizing logic can invent problems where there is only peace, tearing apart sufficiency in the name of optimization.
We've covered a lot of ground.
So, practically speaking, as humans trying to build control architectures for our societies and our own lives that don't drift into madness, how should we reason? What is the correct way to think?
The text gives us a masterclass in cognitive architecture by breaking reason down into 3 distinct interactive types: instrumental, epistemic, and intrinsic. Understanding how these 3 interact is the key to maintaining ethical coherence.
Let's lay them out. We start with the one we've critiqued the most: instrumental reason.
Instrumental reason asks, given an end, what means will achieve it?
So, if you want to win a game of chess, control the center of the board. If you want to cure a disease, sequence the genome. If you want to put out a fire, build a water pump.
Instrumental reason is immensely powerful. We absolutely need it. But it is fundamentally conditional. It cannot, by itself, select the end destination. As the text notes, instrumental reason is a map after a destination has been chosen.
It's the GPS. It tells you the most efficient way to get there, but it is completely mute on the question of whether you should go there.
Now, pure rationalists, or hardcore economists, will often argue that all reason is ultimately instrumental. They argue that humans just have a chaotic bundle of evolutionary preferences, and reason is just the tool we use to satisfy whichever preference is shouting the loudest.
But internalism rejects that as dangerously thin because it completely ignores the reality of disclosure. Suffering is not just a preference. It's not that I just randomly happen to prefer not having my arm broken.
The destination, the need for relief, is not arbitrarily chosen by a biological coin flip. It is structurally demanded by the state itself. The fire demands to be put out.
Which requires the second type of reason, epistemic reason.
Epistemic reason asks, what should be believed or tended to if one is trying to track reality?
This isn't about achieving a goal or crossing a gap. It's about answering to the disclosure of truth. If you look out the window and see it is raining, epistemic reason demands that you believe it is raining.
If you believe a contradiction, you aren't just failing to achieve an optional goal. You are failing the basic conditions of thought. You are severing your connection to reality.
And this is where the title of the paper, Ethics as Epistemology, clicks into place.
If suffering is a tangible, disclosed reality in the universe, then responding to suffering is an epistemic duty. To deny someone suffering, to rationalize it away with a layer 4 political theory, to ignore it because your layer 5 algorithmic control system is optimized for profit, that is not just a failure of compassion.
It is a catastrophic failure to track what is real. It is an epistemic delusion.
And it cuts the other way, too. To look at the peaceful monk and impose a mathematical lack onto them is also an epistemic error. You are misreading tranquility through an alien abstraction. You are hallucinating.
Which brings us to the bedrock, the foundation that grounds the entire system: intrinsic reason.
In traditional philosophy, intrinsic reason is often treated as a spooky, glowing moral law floating in the sky. But in this framework, intrinsic reason is fiercely grounded. It is the direct, unmediated authority of a disclosure that doesn't need to borrow its grip from any external goal.
Intrinsic reason is disclosure before it becomes instruction.
When you touch the hot stove, the suffering doesn't give you a reason to move your hand, because moving your hand promotes some further abstract goal like maximizing total future utility. The suffering gives you a reason to act simply because it is internally against itself. It is the fire. It contains its own imperative.
So how do we build an ethical architecture? We weave all three together.
Instrumental reason says, if you want X, do Y.
Epistemic reason says, if you want to track truth, align your beliefs with the evidence.
Intrinsic reason says, this specific experience suffering discloses its own directional asymmetry. It demands attention.
When a control system, whether it's a government crafting a new law, a tech company deploying an AI, or just you navigating an argument with your partner, aligns all three of these reasons, that is when ethics actually happens.
You recognize the intrinsic protest of the suffering. You use epistemic reason to track exactly where and why it is happening without letting your concepts drift into abstraction.
And then, and only then, you deploy the genius of instrumental reason to build a fire department that actually connects to the base layer of reality.
As the paper beautifully summarizes the entire endeavor, suffering discloses the need for relief. Peace does not disclose the need for optimization.
It is an incredibly rigorous, coherent lens through which to view the world. It strips away the historical baggage of moral dogmas, the endless debates over arbitrary rules, and forces us to look directly, unblinkingly, at the reality of lived experience. It demands that our maps constantly answer to the territory.
It really is a profound paradigm shift.
We have moved entirely away from the dusty moral rulebooks. We are no longer treating ethics like a cosmic courtroom where we argue over abstract concepts of the good that float untethered in the clouds. We are treating ethics as a dynamic, living science of tracking reality.
Practical ethics isn't about blind obedience to a GPS that is happily driving you off a cliff.
It is about making sure our fire departments, our daily habits, our votes, our institutions, our technologies are actually listening to the alarms triggered by the real fire of suffering. And just as importantly, making sure we aren't hallucinating arbitrary fires to solve, just to keep the machinery of our own instrumental intelligence busy.
That's a great way to sum it up.
And that brings me to a final lingering thought for you to carry into your week. We've spent this whole time talking about massive systems. We've talked about governments, AI algorithms, bureaucracies, and CEOs. We've talked about how societal control architectures can drift, becoming genius in service of a stupid master.
But the most immediate control architecture you will ever interact with is your own mind.
Exactly. Look closely at your personal layer 5. Look at your daily habits, your routines, the goals you chase so relentlessly, the metrics you use to judge your own success.
Are those architectures actually tracking the true disclosures of your own lived experience?
Are your actions bringing real, tangible relief to real suffering in yourself and the people around you? Are you allowing the peaceful moments of your life to just be without immediately subjecting them to a utilitarian demand for more?
Or are you deploying your own brilliant instrumental intelligence to endlessly cross from here to there, exhausting yourself in service of a master, a societal expectation, a manufactured lack, an algorithmic demand for engagement that you never actually chose to serve?
Remember the driver from the beginning of our journey. You are behind the wheel, the GPS is barking orders, but the windshield is right in front of you. Are you tracking the map or are you tracking the reality? Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. We will see you next time.